Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in November 2021. And we're starting the week with a very important topic of many sort of hours of debate, and more than hours, but on basically how do you prioritize the risks and vulnerabilities? And we're gonna be focusing mainly on this idea that you need context. So I'm Dinis Cruz. I'm the CTO and CISO of Glasswall. I have quite a bit of security experience. And I'm joined by Petra and Francesco. So Petra, maybe a quick intro about you and what you do and
Hi,
your world.
I'm Petra. I'm a cybersecurity engineer in Glasswall, working with the InfoSec team with Dinis in Glasswall. And yeah, like Dinis said earlier, risks and vulnerabilities and prioritization and context was a hot topic these last few weeks, as we're like working hard to build a good security risk framework so that we can actually make sure that our resources are put in the right place.
And hi, everybody. My name is Francesco Cipollon. I'm Frank for friend, just to make it simple. I'm the CEO and founder for AppSec Phoenix. So our main focus and target is fundamentally risk assessing the hell out of everything. And we're coming from fundamentally a program of work where we try to do this on a number of clients, specifically HSBC was the biggest one, where this was the breakthrough on a lot of things that we embedded in AppSec Phoenix. So bread and butter, cool. Risk.
So basically what we have here is Petra sort of represents the hands down operational security person that is really, has the typical challenges of every security team, too many items, too many projects, too many activities. Where do we focus? What do we do first? How do we minimize risk? How do we make good decisions? How do we make sure that the budgets that we have are well allocated? How do we make sure that management understands and has a good, in a way, ability to make decisions based on security? And Francesco, he's basically has a startup, a company that is trying to figure out how to manage risk, right? Which is, I think, is a very, very key topic because it's, as we'll see, right, there's lots of different areas on this, right? So I'm also quite excited to see what's coming out from that side. So Francesco, do you want to share your slides?
Yeah, let me share. I'm gonna
so it seems like basically I'm the one who has a problem and Francesco has a solution. But yeah, let's see.
Well, like if you look at it from a, let's say, and I represent two hats these days, right? From a CTO and a CISO, right? From a CISO point of view, right? It's the key thing when you talk about vulnerabilities, right? And you talk about, risks is always about, are we putting this into context, right? For the business, because when you then present to a CTO or another exec or another part of the business, they need to be able to see it from their side, and it needs to make, it needs to have context. And the thing that I've learned more and more is that, it's actually easier in a weird way for security to change the context of what we present than to get the other side to understand all the technicalities of security and what actually means. So this is why context is so key.
No, I think what I really like on the conversation that we had in the previous days and building up into this was the key in terms of context and the business perception, but also the empathy towards one side or the other. There is no one solution that fits all. And I think from the work that we did in a number of AppSec programs, we understood that having just one perspective of the security engineers or one perspective of the security team or development team or executive, it doesn't work. It needs to be three kind of heads around the table. But the key things was sitting around the table that has the same data sets. So we can't talk about different views on different data because then the conversation goes haywire. And then from the other side, the consequence of this kind of discussion is either the development team, they talk about features versus security fixes, the security team talking about vulnerabilities in general, and number of high, medium, and low, and executive talking about SLAs or risk. And then these kind of three angles that are fundamentally the same bloody thing, the same aspect, or just a view, if we want to talk in a database view, or just a translation of different things. It's just the complexity that we found on different things is how do we glue these things together, and how we create a model that is consistent across the board and has that kind of view. And those are some of the topic of discussion that I want to cover today. And I think we all stumble across it, right? Dinis, you stumble from your perspective. Petra, you try to stumble it on from a risk perspective. And I'd like to hear what also your perspective is on these things, because I come from financial perspective. So I've done this massively on financial institutions where they're very well used to risk as business impact assessment and other stuff. You guys are coming from a more tech focused firms where they're much more used to engineering words and maybe less on risk. So what is your angles on that aspect?
Yep.
So I've captured probably few talking points that we're going to go maybe through today. That is, I have a slide that is more on the definition, so that at least we talk around the same concept and definitions, because I found that traditionally when we talk about risk, everybody has an opinion about risk. So I wanted to put a placeholder of this is what we think risk is. And then the risk and modern risk perspective, AppSec, risk at different level, and who is responsible for cybersecurity, and DevSecOps and vulnerability management. So in terms of risk, and agree or disagree with me, for me, risk is the probability of something happening and the impact to an organization. Then the element of probability of something happening, or actually the impact, can be interpreted in different way. On application security, you have vulnerability on one end. Mitigation is something that reduces a risk. Residual risk is what remains on the back of a risk. And direct versus indirect impact is how much damage you can produce versus how much it remains, or how much the ripple effect of that event happening cause. And then we have, in most security world, the term threat, the term vulnerability, and the term consequence. Consequence can also be similar to impact. I don't want to do too much on it, but is there anything else in the conversation that you guys think we missed?
Well, I just wanted to add here that, classic kind of also risk definition that they teach you in uni is like, vulnerability plus threat equals risk. And I think, and yours one is pretty similar. And I think these are, like a real good technical way of describing it. But I just want to mention the challenges that you get probably sometimes when you're on the technical end is presenting this. So like this, with this taxonomy, with this definition, presenting risk to your executive team, because a lot of times they will not understand the vulnerability. They will not understand the threat. They might just understand the consequence and the impact. So therefore, like, this is where it comes from, that everyone has their own opinion on risk. It's just because it depends on the audience, right? Like, it depends who is listening. And if we define risk in a technical way and we present it to the CISO will perfectly understand what we're talking about. But if we present it to the CEO, he will be like, just looking at us like, oh, just guys, tell me what's important. So what do you guys think?
Yeah. So the thing about this, right, is from a definitions, right? It's okay if we apply, let's say, the business angle to this. So, for example, when you look at a probability, it needs to be backed in a way by data, right? Like, this is not 10 years ago where a lot of these things were theoretical, right? The reason I like incidents a lot, right, and I always make sure that we have a very good incident process, is not just so that, hey, when stuff happens, you prepared, you have fire drills, you kind of know what to do, not in the middle of an incident, you figure out what happened. It also gives you lots of good data, right? It gives you lots of good data because ultimately a probability, right, is never events over time, right? So the probability of exploitation means that you need to have some data to support it. And then when you go to the impact of the organization, you need to put that from a business point of view, right? To have an impact of, we got, that thing got compromised. Again, it depends, right? You can have a server that has no data, that has nothing, cares about it, right? If that gets compromised, it's not good, so of course, right? There's a bunch of other stuff. In fact, what I think sometimes we don't do very well is that we need to map out basically almost like the second level vulnerabilities, right? So when you have a vulnerability, it doesn't appear in vacuum, right? It wasn't just created. Like every vulnerability is a consequence of the environment that created that vulnerability. And I
So
actually think that
metadata for
it's not.
vulnerability.
No, it's not just metadata. Is for example, right? If you have, the typical cross-site scripting, authorization blind spot happening, right, on an application, right? That didn't appear in vacuum, right? That's a consequence of lack of good coding practices, lack of static analysis testing, lack of dynamic testing, lack of threat modeling, right? Probably a CI pipeline that doesn't have security checks going in, lack of visibility in all sorts of areas, right? Probably using frameworks that allow those things to occur in the first place, right? So for me, those are more interesting vulnerabilities because they're still a vulnerability. You can argue that if you're using a platform that allows certain vulnerabilities to occur, well, that's a vulnerability in itself, right? Because that's what will create other problems. If you don't do threat models, in a way, that's a vulnerability on your pipeline, right?
So I agree with you. I agree with you, but there is a concept that is we kind of. I feel that this is where also OWASP Top 10 has gone now with security by design and security misconfiguration mixed with the vulnerability, because we've been categorizing vulnerability as you say, cross-site scripting, as everything that is more logical or direct to code or direct to a specific problem. And then there are systemic problem or contextual problem that is what I call metadata around vulnerability, or maybe I should call it contextual data around vulnerability, that are, I think, two level, or where they are deployed. So the configuration issue, the configuration aspect, or the misconfiguration or the security weakness of a system in general. And then there is the more systemic things that are linked to process procedures or doing things in the correct way that can be measured a little bit with more the maturity model, like Sam, like you were rightfully saying, like, are you having this code practice or this element, or are you deploying this in a standard way with standard things that are, in my opinion, a little bit more difficult to measure and to keep it consistent, or at least to keep a consistent measurement, as long as you have a consistent measurement in the back of it or in the back of your mind.
Yeah, that's actually very important because, and I want to go back to a comment that Louis Servin just mentioned there, right? Is that ultimately what's important here is to have a common language, right? And almost what's very important, as I wanted to mention when I saw this, is that every organization needs to find a fact-based, logical way to represent this, right? And every company has different sense of gravity, so you need to have a little flexibility. So what I like about this definition is saying in cybersecurity, vulnerability, it's a weakness, right? Yes, right. It's a weakness, right? Now, whether the question Louis was asking is XSS a vulnerability? It could be an attack, right? In terms of the thing about the taxonomy, right? What I find interesting is that it's very easy sometimes to get bogged down by the taxonomy. I think it's more important to find what works in an organization.
A common language.
If an organization wants to call X an apple, even if you want to argue about it, right? You might go, fine. If everybody understands what that means, right? So that's what I was saying, that for me, a vulnerability is a weakness, right? And the weakness can be in the process, in the codes, in the CI pipeline, in how we detect, is across the board, right? So it's very important that we understand those side effects, right? That basically are causing something to occur, right? Or something to be possible, which is sometimes what we talk in security. Hey, this is possible, right? Yeah, look, for example, like the Louis just mentioned that cross-site scripting is a typical example of mixing code and data, right? Which is actually a very clear violation of a security principle, right? You should never allow code and data to be mixed, right? The question becomes is, are you using frameworks that allow that to happen, right? So if you compare, let's say, the latest version of React with the early versions of JSPs or ASP.NET or some of even the JavaScript frameworks, you will see that it's a very different set of worlds, right? One almost allowed everything to be mixed. Like jQuery is insane, right? Like every freaking thing is almost code and data if you're not careful, right?
But that's a systemic approach to removing risk, I think, on looking at risk in a different way. So there are risk and if I want, I call it vulnerability debt or security debt, similar to tech debt, that you need to cut down. That is your bulk list of vulnerability that still need to be addressed, because organizations have SLAs with client that says vulnerability need to be fixed in X amount of days, or you need to do something about vulnerability, like ISO, like I don't think even PCI DSS, but there are a number of regulations that mandate doing something in X amount of days, or is a contractual obligation that you have with the client. And I had a whole argument with Jim Manico on calling security problem bug problem, and then we had the whole discussion. So the podcast is going to come out in January. We have a half an hour, 10 minutes discussion around this. But aside from that, I think what you just addressed is another element of the systemic issue, to actually focus, instead of tackling vulnerability by vulnerability, tackling on the issue at the source, and trying to use coding language that remove the possibility in itself, or make it very hard for this to happen, because has already embedded a lot of those things. And I think this has been a good example of SQL injection going down in the top 10, because there is more modern language that make it harder for this to happen.
And look, Petra, John, on this one, can you address this from the point of view of how do you see the impact of a mature, okay, let me rephrase this. How do you see the impact of teams' ability to make code changes to the team's ability to fix things that get presented to them?
I'm not sure if I understand what you mean, like the impact of a team being able to change their code.
If you have two teams, right? You have two teams. Team A is able to push code very quickly, right? Regardless of security, right? Just bugs. They have a very quick development pipelines. Every sprint they fix in 10, 20, 30, 40 things, right? Another team makes, maybe actually agile in the right sense of words, right? And then you have another team which is a lot more cautious. They tend to push big things out, right? When you arrive with your bucket list of stuff to fix, right? What's kind of your experience on their embracing and fixing the vulnerabilities?
So my experience is, in practicality, that your agile teammate will be the ones who will embrace it. Like, even though they will probably in the process produce maybe some new vulnerabilities, but I think in the end, the overall outcome will be that the vulnerability count will start going down. While in the team B, which is kind of like, maybe they are more secure in their coding to begin with, but then it's really hard to introduce change. It has to go through several processes, and by the time you go through all these processes, you can this can get exploited, and your exploit can come out in the wild, and a vulnerability that maybe was not so big in the meantime can become exploitable, and it can become a much bigger issue. So
vulnerability agility is trump, or the agility, or the speed of deployment, it trumps the break in the pipeline.
Well, I was all the way to.
I'm not being fictitious. I'm actually, it's something that.
No.
Breaking the pipeline.
What do you mean
breaking the pipeline is extreme. No. Breaking a pipeline is stopping you going to production because you have issues. That is, generally speaking, approach of a lot of organizations when they say, "Oh, we do security because we block a team from actually deploying into production if they have vulnerability." I think in a more traditional organization, that's true. That's, generally speaking, the approach, or the stand, or they just don't have that policy whatsoever. And I like the idea of security agility, because I am a firm subscriber that the faster you can react to something, the quicker you can fix things. Or if you break something, you can fix it quickly if you have that muscle agility built in, because this is part of the retrospective. If you find a security issue, it's part of the retrospective. You plan it for the next sprint, next 2 sprint, done. It's the agility, it's the security agility. It's something we actually developing called license to operate, that measure or give you a response if the team is actually performing from a security perspective on a trending line, if they're consistently reducing vulnerability. So we move away. We are developing something to actually force people to move away from high, medium, and low in this particular release of, this is the performance overall. So this team is trustable from a security perspective, because they actually their security agility is higher than other teams. So we're thinking things in security agility, because I'm absolutely subscribing. And actually we're doing this overcranked, because we layer on other policy like training and other stuff that you can kind of select and create this concept of license to operate or license to deploy. And if you perform to specific code or contract that the organization have with the team of what security actually means, you can actually go ahead, even if you're introducing 1 million vulnerability, but then you fix them tomorrow, it's much better than a team that has one vulnerability that is critical, that is on a front end of a server that is that generate a lot of money for the organization and is there for months.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I would put like one little exception here is, for example, in this agile kind of team, I would add the capacity still to block some releases if the vulnerability is like, critical, exploitable, and, puts the application at risk, like right here, right now, if they, do a release. So in this scenario, like definitely the agile team, like you said as well, with, a little leverage to the security team to block a release in order to like, protect something that can be exploitable like tomorrow.
Yeah, and Louis specify vulnerability in your own code or a dependency. So vulnerability regardless, in a library, in a dependency, in anything. So yeah. SCA, code, Dust, Web Dust, Mast, and Rust, if you want to throw it in another term. So they're all in the same mix.
But it needs to have context, right? Again, the challenge I always put is that you don't fix a vulnerability just because some for example some tool picked up that there's a vulnerability in that particular module, right? Like it's a sign also of maturity to be able to say, yes, that particular framework or dependency is vulnerable, but we don't use that, or it doesn't affect us, right?
But that's why I think moving away from the concept of vulnerability and moving away into and I'm jumping on the next talking point, that is effectively talking in modern risk, or what I consider modern risk, is moving away from talking about vulnerability in the atomic level, because a vulnerability doesn't have attributes. It has high, medium, and low, and that's about it in the more bare-bone element, and doesn't have the context and concept and concept of context. Screw myself over.
But let's not lose. There's a question I want to ask, because I think follows the previous one, right? So so here's my question, right? Can we use the speed of vulnerability fix, which is what you're talking about that we measure, right, as a way to measure the health of a development team?
I think so.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would even say, there is another element that we're taking in, because we interface with Jira now, and we are measuring kind of another balance, that is the number of fixes versus the number of bug fixes, that a number of feature versus the number of bug fixes, that is the velocity or kind of the muscle that the team has on fixing security bug versus introducing new features. That's another element that we take into consideration, that you can activate or deactivate potentially. But it's another indicator that we are looking at to see the healthiness or the securityness or the agilityness from a security perspective of a specific team.
If I ask follow-up question, so we're saying that the security team can provide to the business very valuable data on the health of those teams.
Yes, and I think actually the security team can provide a contract that the business can inscribe in terms of policy with the development team. So that runs or goes away from fixing vulnerability into something that is much more implementable into leveraging the data that we have. I think going away, I've seen a lot of organizations that just say, fix critical vulnerability in 5 days, period, across the board. And that's a contract that they put together with even clients. Or fixing a specific vulnerability in X amount of days. If you're a vendor, is okay. But if you're a client with an enormous deployment, that lacks context. I think and that generally speaking get ignored. You know, this blind or blanket policy tend to get ignored, and we see the effort. You know, we inserted the policy in there because it's a good indicator, but it shouldn't be the only indicator of, you know, you're fixing vulnerability. And we started talking much more about risk. So we can take this concept even beyond and start writing policy base that is based on data that we kind of gather from as a security team, and start writing policies that actually make sense and they are implementable, and they're much better indicator of the healthiness of a development team. There can't be just one single fixed vulnerability. That is the modern statement, because a lot of organizations don't understand development, engineering. A lot of organizations from a higher level perspective don't understand engineering and are not supposed to understand engineering.
Okay, so here's my next question. Can you measure a maturity, okay, I'll rephrase again. Can you measure an organization's ability to understand engineering based on the data points that they're able to collect on their vulnerability remediation fixes?
I might be wrong, but I say no. I would say you can measure the ability for an organization to understand engineering on the kind of security policy they mandate on the engineering team.
I don't know, Petra, what do you think?
I think, you know, there is some organizations that will put no, like, they won't put much weight on security because they have a different use case. But that still might not mean that they don't fully understand engineering. It just might mean they're kind of accepting the risk in a way. So, you know, I think you can say that on a case-by-case scenario, depending on how much weight and like an organization puts on security and how much that is actually necessary in their context.
Okay, but if you go, and Francesco, you were talking about, you know, that when you collect the data, right, the amount of data that you're able to collect, right, is almost directly proportional to the maturity of the organization engineering point of view, right? So if you have 3 teams, right, you go to the first team and you ask the same question. Hey, here's a bunch, you know, we want to measure your vulnerability metrics, right? We want to measure how you guys finding, you know, and fixing vulnerabilities, because we want to measure, we're going to capture that delta, right? If the first team, you have 3 teams, A, B, C, right? If the first team says, look, we don't even know where the code is, right? We don't run CI/CD pipeline. It's built over there. It gets shipped over here, right? We don't track those things, right? You got team B who goes, oh yeah, you know, we do some threat modeling, we do some analysis, we found a couple of things, right? We're trying to fix them, but we're struggling. There's lots of stuff in the pipeline. We don't have a lot of developers, right? But we're kind of getting it done. And the third one is, yeah, we've integrated with ABC tools, right? We've imported all our repos into those tools, which, as Petra knows, is not a trivial exercise, right? We've basically now integrated CI pipelines for both static analysis and dynamic analysis. And we now got to the point where we got, you know, every sprint that we fix the stuff. And second thing, we're running out of things to fix, right? Because, you know, we trim them along and we have a good SLA for those. Like, if you could say that every one of these, I was talking about security, I can take a view of it as a CTO and saying, I can do the same level of analysis from a pure engineering point of view.
But that's a different level of maturity. You just described a different level of maturity of teams. But let me challenge you with this, because I've seen this on the extreme. So I've seen massive onboarding. So they had the data, but the data actually start hitting them in the wrong way, where there wasn't the contextual aspect on the data and there wasn't the relatability aspect on the data. Yeah. So you can have massive amount of data, but that's not a good indicator that the organization as a whole might give a direction that makes sense or is in line with their data. So
that's a vulnerability, right?
But that's a systemic vulnerability of the organization.
No. That's a vulnerability, right, of the system, right? Like, this is the thing I found interesting, right? We talk in code vulnerabilities because we say there's a model of what's supposed to happen. People use it in a different way, and now X is possible, right? You know, I can use that to describe, you know, a code injection vulnerability and a vulnerability like you just described of a system where you basically have a lot of data, people are not processing it correctly, they're not taking the time to process it so that they don't make good decisions, or they don't have context. It's still a vulnerability, right? A vulnerability is a weakness.
It's still a risk.
No,
it's still
it's
a
a weakness.
risk.
No. It's a weakness. The risk is the side effect of it, right? It's the weakness. A system that doesn't understand what it does, a system that A doesn't talk to B, right? It's basically it's a vulnerability, right? But you know, a vulnerability doesn't necessarily just to be in code, right? It's a weakness in the system. And my point with the 3 teams, actually, I would say these 3 teams are representative of real world, right? In any organization, you're going to have teams that are super good and teams from code that nobody even knows how it works, right? Now that's real world stuff, right? My point here is that we need in security, we need to start to talk about engineering maturity, right? Because these days, you know, I'm telling you, there's a one-to-one relationship between being able to reduce the risk and fix vulnerabilities and not mature, I would say effective development teams. By the way, it would be mature, but you know, teams that can ship products or can push changes very fast. And this can be at the network level, can be at the application level, can be at organization level, doesn't matter, right? The ability to drive change is probably the biggest signal that you can have of can you fix the issues? And that in itself is a good pointer for a mature, and again, I don't want to not towards an effective development team or the effective organization. And this is very important because when you then overlay on this, the business objectives and what the business is trying to do and the acceleration that the business wants to do, again, you're going to find that the amount of attrition that you have in teams that cannot ship fast is way higher than the teams that can react very fast. So you can see that there's from a business point of view, that's where it starts to get interesting, because the business needs to make a decision based on where do I invest, right? What is the maturity of my engineering?
But then on the other side, if you don't have, you could go very, very fast and you could build so much security I mean, not in your case. In your case, you had a very mature, fast team that also has a security concept built up into it. But also you can have from another perspective, organization that can push so much code or team that can push so much code without any concept of security whatsoever. So I think we're layering 2 levels: the maturity of a team or the maturity from a security perspective of a team.
Let me finish on that one, right? Challenge you on that one, right? Because, and I think that's a very important point, because that's, and to be honest, I remember really being worried about it. I remember when we started to talk about CI/CD pipelines and all that stuff, I remember thinking, whoa, this is insane, because it means a vulnerability will hit real world much faster, right? Which is kind of the thing, right? In practice, what I've seen is first of all, there's a natural selection of the cowboy development, right? So put it this way, if you have a team that is coding like cowboys, right? Basically, literally pushing code to production, if he compiles, ship it, which is basically used to be the model in the past, right? Compile, freaking ship it. These days, especially with any kind of app that has some traction, real world will blow them off, right? Literally, they're going to have not just security problems, they're going to have stability, they're going to have all sorts of other things. So what you find that the teams that are able to ship fast, they end up having very good engineering practices, because the only way you can ship fast is very solid, good engineering that allows you to go live, that allows you to build QA environments that are really good, that allows you to have a level of deployability, a level of confidence in shipping that you only get with good engineering. And even in the worst case scenario, which was they had no idea about security, they actually code some big security vulnerabilities, as soon as they get exploited, right? Or as soon as they do a test or something, that team is going to be able to much quicker get to a very good level of security. So in the reality, my experience is that you show me a team that can ship very quickly, very effectively. I see a team that solved 20 things right. And usually security is one of them. Even if it isn't, they solve the hardest part of getting security right, which is to build those pipelines.
to build unmanned security code and unmanned production and push to production, yes, but you still, how many in modern organization, how many of these high performing team you have?
You have a lot more than you think, right? But the point is that, and this is the interesting point now, right? Is that you have real data to show that that's where innovation and that's where reliability comes from. And this is what my point is. If you want to reach out to the business, one of the contexts that we need to have is not just about the context of what is the impact of this vulnerability, but what is the root causes of those problems. And because for the business, we want to be in a position where we say, I really like this idea that security should be driving improvements in the CI pipeline and should be finding allies in the business to say, hey, everybody wants here, but security, we really need it because we have this freaking long tail of things that we would like to get fixed, that if the CI pipeline doesn't get improved, then we struggle with that.
But at this point in time, I mean, you're describing systemic changes, but 90% of the time, in organizations that I dealt with, security team were firefighting vulnerability, and they were just completely overwhelmed by vulnerability because that was the contract that the whole organization have put with security and development team of this is what security means. And I agree with you. You can resolve systemic things and can remove a whole category of issues from a number of organizations. And a good example is, for example, authentication that is usually broken because there then doesn't need to be like 400 of way of doing authentication. If there is just one way for organization and having the security team driving that thing, it could remove systemically a whole category of issue. But then you need to remove a security team and enabling a paved way of what I've been talking in the past called paved way, also Netflix, Robinhood, Databricks. There are tons of other people that are talking about paved way. By removing security engineers and by having a security tiger team that serves the whole organization and enable them to deploy faster, that's the way to go. But then you still have the vulnerability that are in there, and contextualized, non-contextualized, they're still there. So you just need to remove the security from the front line of vulnerability firefighting, fundamentally. And that's my whole argument with using risk.
Yep. Look, so Luis, you can join, man. Put your camera on, man.
Yes.
Join the
Put a face
right?
on it.
Yeah. No, Luis is saying, there you go, right? Do you want to just, cool. Do you want to just say that your last 3 sentences are spot on, right? Like you just want to.
Sure. I'm just quoting famous people here, right? So, okay, I got the right microphone. Last time I got the wrong microphone. Security is everyone's responsibility. So trying to assign to a team solving vulnerabilities in code in which they have no context, no understanding, makes no sense. Who has the best information to fix a vulnerability? The developer. So what can you do as a security team? You can enable developers to find vulnerabilities fast, fail fast, learn, iterate. Find your vulnerabilities fast, learn from them, and if you don't understand it, come to me as a security person, expert, or whatever you want to call the person, right, or the group, and I'll help you fix it. But try first, and don't wait until a big something at the end of the rainbow to do the checks, right? It's something that should happen every day, every time, preferably in your IDE. If you're using something lightweight like semgrep, there's no need. You could even make a Git trigger to do it on push time. So you could have you cannot push vulnerabilities into your Git repository if semgrep reports an error. That's right there, immediate feedback for your developers, right? Your developers open their eyes and you gain something. Security champions. Now, security champions is the path to success, because if you trust the reports out there, it's about 1 security person per 100 developers.
Yeah,
give or take. That's a figure I have in my head.
750 to 1, actually.
Let's say 50 to 1. So
that's it.
There's absolutely no way. I mean, how can you plug so many vulnerabilities? I mean, you just take the most simple, absurd example, right? Node.js. Take the node-based image. Docker pull node 14. Just did it right now while you were talking. It has over 100 vulnerabilities. So is it my responsibility as a security expert to patch it? Or is it my responsibility to help the teams to maybe not download Node.js, but download an Alpine version of Node.js, which offers a lot less attack surface, right? So now you don't have the whole ship, you just have the front of the ship. So you go from 900 megabytes to maybe 100 megabytes. The amount of packages in the base image distribution, without even counting your code, right? Your code hasn't even been analyzed. It's just the layer upon which your code will run is so bad. It will rot whatever you put in it. It will be vulnerable by design.
So Luis, a question on that one, right? So what you're saying is that the security team should be working on this sort of layered approach, right? Where you have subject matter experts, security champions, and then the developers who care about it. And the example you're talking about, for example, where Node.js by default comes with a bunch of vulnerabilities, which I agree, is quite shocking, right? Should the security team be working with the developments and the CI pipeline to, for example, create a secure build, right? To create a default secure container that can run the code, that the security team can almost make the business case to say, look, even if security is not your primary concern, this has less moving parts, is smaller, will run faster, right? And we now can prove that it works because there's no side effects beginning to end. Isn't that one of the great places for security to spend time and resources on?
Sure.
Yes.
I agree with you.
And I think that's ultimately where security should build pave way, or you have a tactical team of security that works on systemic things, that solve systemic problems. So instead of solving the individual vulnerability, solve systemic things. But that requires also a contract of the business to have the perception of what that means, to have the understanding of engineering and actually how to carve out. I've seen a lot of organization on just mandating blank policy because they don't understand the concept of engineering and how certain engineering works. And there are a lot of organizations that thinks in that way because engineering is not in the front foot of what they do. Technology companies are a little bit more privileged, like Netflix and other, where the conversation of engineering actually makes sense and it's easy to translate an engineering concept on fixing systemic things by having a tactical team that serves and remove, instead of fixing 10 times the same things, it just fixes one thing and then everybody feeds into that one things. Right. Identity, golden image, repository patterns.
But isn't that what modern risk management should be all about, right? Dealing more with systemic
But you need
issues.
to translate in terms of risk. But you need to translate it in terms of risk mitigation and what you're actually trying to do. And a lot of organizations that don't have the concept of engineering struggle to translate the benefit of having a dedicated team. And that's why these teams get disbanded very quickly in a lot of organizations.
Yeah. But that one, sorry, go on, Petra.
I would also come back to your question, Dinis, about like how much does, how much we can see in all the data around vulnerabilities, how much we can see the maturity, the understanding of the company about the on engineering. So maybe just to like go back on that, actually like a company can understand engineering really well, but still not reach the maturity in it. So maybe they do understand the concepts, but maybe they do, are working towards it. They have a roadmap, but still are not at that point of, on the worldly map. They're not on the commoditized part where they will kind of reach that maturity. Will they'll actually be using all of the understanding in practice because they have to ship something really fast. And if they don't, they're a startup and they're going to fail. But, maybe they have excellent engineers who really understand everything.
But
the business priority is different.
Yeah. Yeah. And
but you see, Petra, what I saw once, I know not once, like several times, which I always found fascinating, especially when I was doing lots of security reviews. I remember doing security reviews at those kind of companies that were like going very fast, right?
Yeah.
And the irony is that you cannot do good engineering, right, without doing good security. right? Like the bottom line is that most of the security practices that we talk about are good engineering practices, right? I remember this interesting story. I think it's from Microsoft, but and I don't know the full details, but I remember, but it makes complete sense. Where I think it was one of the most mission criticals in teams in Microsoft. The bit that really understands security. They were saying we don't have security guys, right? We don't do security. But when you talk to them, because they were like, yeah, of course, data validation. Of course, we do data validation. Well, don't you validate all your inputs? Authorization, authentication. Well, don't you know, right? All the roles and stuff that you're supposed to do, right? Literally you went down the whole security landscape of problems, and every one of them, that team was so good that for them, all of them were engineering practices, right? Like threat modeling. What do you mean you don't have architecture diagrams? What do you mean you haven't mapped out, right, the stuff you do? So what I found was that when you have a really good engineering team, most of the time you have a lot of good security. The problem with those teams happens with scale. Is when they become successful, and now they need to bring another 20, 30, 50 developers, and that crowd doesn't understand by design, because they're not the people working 12 hours a day coding and making a lot of changes on it, right? Which goes back to the point of when you have very effective development environments, you end up having good engineering, because if you don't, things fail, right? So you almost, it's almost there's a gravity that forces you to do the right thing, and security goes with it. The problem you have is when you don't have that.
There is a level of that gravity, and there is a level of that engineering. And maybe back on Petra's point, there is a level of startup that has good engineering, but there's also a lot of startup that start with like cobbling up a bunch of code or having maybe one or few developer. Not every high performing startup means that they had a good engineering practice. But I agree with you. Speed tend to just address systemic or structural things, and those structural things are very linked to security resiliency and security in general.
Also, and what happens the first time those startups hit traffic, things blow up, right?
Or maybe not, but certain things might blow up.
They usually do. There's definitely a one-to-one connection with the startup that is just cobbling things together with massive security vulnerabilities, right? So, sorry, Petra, over to you.
But it's also quite interesting because some of the really good engineers, because there is this, in the engineering and development world, there is some kind of like, it's like friction towards security. So like I have some good friends who are like really good developers and they're really good engineers. And they always tease me like, oh, security, who cares about that? But then when I talk to them about it, they actually do everything right. So like, even though they don't mention it, they don't like talk about it. Like, of course I do, data validation. Of course I, protect my EC2 instances, whitelist them. And of course I never make my S3 bucket public. Like, it's always like, of course I do that. Of course I follow the OWASP time. I'm not an idiot. I'm like, but then you do care about security. Oh, no.
Security is not security. Security is just doing things right.
Yeah, exactly.
But the problem is what is security? And that's a topic that tends to get very controversial very soon, because I do a lot of threat models, and I go to teams and the first thing everyone wants to do is tell me what they're doing for security, and I say, fantastic, what are you doing for security? Oh, we have TLS enabled. Okay, well, that's one aspect of security, but what else are you doing? Then the thing I have learned over the years, and I have been working doing this for a long time now. I was working at an engineering company that was doing cars until last year, right? So cars are not the typical thing you think of in the terms of security. Now they must do it. But when I started interacting with the RD people, the ones designing the vehicles, they didn't want to know anything about security, right? So I was creating noise for them. So if you rephrase and avoid the word security as if it were a bad word, right? Just like you teach children not to say the F word, you don't say the S word. And you move away from security and say assurance. And then you define assurance because assurance is pretty well defined by the CMU, the Center for Security Design, and I don't know.
CMMM.
Yeah, you know that. So you redefine it and you shift the conversation away from the bad word into assurance, and you define assurance as your system should be doing exactly what it was designed to do, not less and not more. And by no more, I mean, no one is able to take it over. No one is able to drop it. No one is able to
hold on. Is that not
the data of your customers, right? And then you have another level of conversation, because now you're not the bad person telling the bad word.
So you're saying
that
as a security, as engineering, we should be building the bridges, how they're designed to be built, and not just cutting corner and just doing fast things fast.
And
sure,
in context,
and
right?
there's another topic,
Louis,
right? Which team topologies.
So what Louis is really saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm being facetious for a reason. I'm being facetious for a reason.
yeah. But you see what Louis is saying, and I completely agree, is the whole point, right? What he's doing is he's saying, don't go to that car team and talk about security vulnerabilities. Yeah. Put whatever you're talking about in context with good engineering, and in this case, assurance, which they care about, right? And I think that the biggest, I think, for me, takeaway on a lot of this is that more and more I view security is good engineering, right? Yeah. And if you have good engineering, you get good products. If a business doesn't want to build good products, if they don't understand technology, if they don't understand, well, that's a bigger problem. There's nothing. You're already handicapped from the get-go, right? But I think a lot of the stuff we talk about here, and I actually think modern risk is about good engineering practices, and security can be a massive driver on that. If we view ourselves almost as we are not just fixing vulnerabilities, we're making the business better, we're making engineering better, we're giving them assurance. I want to bring Abbas because he got his hand raised up, Abbas, and then go on, Abbas.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I joined a bit late, but it's a very interesting conversation. I just wanted to add what and emphasize on what Lewis was talking about. You know, I worked in IT for a good number of years, and now in cybersecurity. And you know, usually like people first resist to change. When you say security, it's kind of like scare them. So basically, if you approach this like from what these people desire, what they like to talk about, you know, just like, you know, it's just you know, just make sure put yourself in their in what's attractive to them. So let's say if I want to approach sales, it's like, yeah, we're gonna need, you know, you're gonna have 2FA, you're gonna have all of these stuff, like, you know, to secure like some perimeters. It's gonna piss them off. Like it's not gonna attract them. But if you're gonna go and say, listen, you know, this, you know, if you add 2FA to our product and add this and this and this, that, you know, will make your selling, you know, we will be selling this product better. And same thing with the product team. Sometimes, like, you know, features like security features, at sometimes they are like kind of overhead to them because they are trying to keep up the pace and the speed. If you approach it in a way like, you know, if you approach it from their point of view, from their desire, you put yourself in their comfort zone, you know, that will allow you to sell security in a better way and not scare people the security. Yeah. And I learned, believe me, I learned this like, you know, the very hard way. So yeah, so thank you.
I like the empathy. So I like the concept of empathy and the concept of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and making the message more relatable to who you're talking with. And that's one of my angle on the modern risk, on actually translating vulnerability as a concept of vulnerability in terms of risk, in terms of something that's the more executive team can maybe relate on. And this was a problem of, you know, no engineers on earth want to do shitty code. No engineer on earth want to push bad things. They just don't have the time to do it. And in order to give the time, you need to have with the whole organization the discussion on, okay, we either ship fast in a week, or we take maybe a week and a half, a sprint and a half, to actually add these little features that's going to make us more resilient, more security fitness, more able to sell, or less risky. That is my element on the whole security vulnerability take, on contextualizing this even with the management team to actually bring them into the conversation and give developer time to fix this, because this has made, I've seen that it made dramatic changes into that.
And I think, Francesco, that's a great way to wrap up, because you need to go to your next session.
I need to breathe and drink a coffee.
Exactly.
You need another session.
It's a great way to
continue
describe modern risk. And I'm
going to continue this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So Louis, let's do another session next summer that with the four of us will continue, on talking point number 2, because we barely made it past the first one. This has been really good. No, great
We
stuff.
can carry
Right.
this conversation on Wednesday. We're gonna talk about the audience you approach and how to make people accountable for their risks, and what is your audience and how do you approach that audience, because this is one of the very interesting things you do in risk. Because if I present something to Dinis as a CTO and tell him I have a bug in that system somewhere there, I need to make sure I present, I bubble it up from that lower level risk to a higher level, to Dinis's level. So we are definitely talking about this on Wednesday, on the 11th. So I would encourage all of you to join our session. Thank you, Dinis. Sorry.
And I'm going to talk
Cool.
about this stuff
Absolutely.
in later talk. So there will be plenty of Q&A session later on in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 10 minutes.
Brilliant. All right. So we'll wrap it up. And thanks everybody for participating.
Cheers.
Thank you, guys.
Everyone.
Bye.
See you in a
Bye.
bit.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. See you on the other side, man.
See you later.